It's Tuesday, July 14th, Bastille Day, which will come up later on in our discussion. And welcome back to GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns. Our format's a conversation. Hoover Senior Fellows debate what's going on and what may lie ahead in these complicated times. I'm John Cochrane. I'm an economist and the Rosemarie and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution. I also author the Grumpy Economist blog. I'm sitting in for our usual host, Bill Whalen, who's off this week. This week, we're very pleased to be joined by a special guest Goodfellow. Victor Davis Hanson is the Martin and Illy Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Victor is a prolific classicist and military historian. His latest book, The Case for Trump, was a bestseller in 2019, and it's now available in paperback. Victor writes a syndicated column, a column for National Review. He's the host of the Classicist podcast for Hoover, and he appears frequently on Fox News. In his copious spare time, he runs an almond and raisin farm in Selma, California, which has been owned by his family for almost 100 years. A warm welcome to you, Victor.
Thank you for having me.
Now let's meet the regular Goodfellows. Niall Ferguson is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's the author of 15 books and counting, most recently The Square on the Tower. He writes a weekly column for Bloomberg News, and you should watch his TV series based on that book, Niall Ferguson's Networld, now running on PBS. Hi, good to see you again, Niall.
Good to see you, John. Good to see you too, Victor, and also HR.
Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster is the Hoover Institution's Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow. Prior to returning to Hoover, he served as the National Security Advisor to the President. General McMaster is also the author of Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, coming out this fall, but you can pre-order it now. Hi, HR.
Hi, John, Neil, Victor, good to be with you.
So, Victor, we got to get the elephant out of the room first. You wrote The Case for Trump 2 years ago, and how times have changed in the last 6 months. The president isn't doing so well in the polls. Democrats are urging Biden to go big to grab the Senate and governorships as well. So certainly it's time for an update. How do you see the case for Trump now?
I think he's pretty much where he is. At least about a week ago, he was where he was in 2016. He was running about 12 to 10 points behind Hillary Clinton. He closed up a little bit in mid-July, and nobody thought he had a chance to win. So I think poll-wise, he's about where he was. Some of the state polls, he's a little bit better, but we've never had anything like 2020. I think most people would agree that, say, in January 15th, there was despair. The Democratic primaries had not gone well. Bernie and Bloomberg, the non-choice between Bernie and Bloomberg resurrected Joe Biden, who had been discarded in the first initial primaries. And then the COVID hit, and then the lockdown, and then the May 25th protest and cultural revolution that ensued. And I think all of that created a sense that the key swing voters were in a fetal position. They just sort of said, I want it all to go away. And maybe if Donald Trump just goes away, it'll all go away. And that seems to be governing the polls now. But I think they're so volatile in 30 days. We're seeing sort of, I think I wrote a column today called peak Jacobinism, that we're getting to the point where when you read this Harper's letter of 153 leftist luminaries, or Bari Weiss resigning today from the New York Times, the Hollywood, some of the actors have been vocal about they don't like the new racial demands put on them. And I think Roz Simone of CHOP is back to renting out his real estate empire, and the low-hanging fruit of statues have been toppled, and you've either got to go big with a crane and get Mount Rushmore or Stone Mountain, or you got to go into the absurd of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. So,
if I may, what it sounds like you're saying is that the battle has not been joined, really.
No.
Joe Biden is campaigning from his front basement. And we don't really know what agenda, policies, or message the president is going to stress. So I'd like to ask you sort of two questions on that. Where do you think the president will or should go in his case to the voters for the election. And this issue you just mentioned, in the last election, the polling showed after the fact that the great swath of deplorables felt pretty bad about where they had been consigned by our country's elites. And I wonder how they are sitting out there in the heartland where you live, thinking about the quick changes in our, as you said, revolution, or at least attempted revolution.
Well, I think to answer your first question first, very quickly, I don't think it's going to work for him to rattle off his signature achievements. I think HRs knows that from the foreign policy that constructive realism did work pretty well. We were in a better position vis-a-vis China and Iran and other belligerents. And the natural gas and oil production and low record unemployment for minorities, and the economy was doing well, as you know, John. But that's all ancient history now, and it doesn't do any good to rail like Achilles. It's unfair that Agamemnon has all the status and you did all the work. So he's got to quit that, and he's got to focus. He's only got 100 and something days, 10 days or something. And he's got to give us an agenda that goes beyond MAGA 1.0. And I think some of them have to be, some of those recommendations or policies or agendas or trajectories have to be specific to the crisis we're in. He's got to, I think, appoint a group of people or have a vision about the virus, because we're going to have another one of these. And it's going to have to be far-reaching, that we not only have to outline how we're going to bring back key industries that are essential in a time of a quarantine and an epidemic, but we're going to have a standard of quarantine, red, yellow, blue, green, so it's not just ad hoc. And we did that after 9/11. We're going to have some national board of disinterested scientific experts that tell us what defines a case versus somebody who has antibodies versus the case to fatality rate, et cetera, et cetera. It's all over the map today, and it's a mess. And then I think infrastructure, I don't like the name, spending more money for infrastructure, but if it was targeted infrastructure that addressed some of these concerns, I really do think that the high-rise mass transit, dense population model that we were sold on during the Obama years is not a good model. It's better to disperse the population, work on the interstate freeway system, reservoirs, dams, bridges, roads, finish out a lot of the incomplete transportation system to get the population more diverse. I think he needs to talk about the debt. I kind of like the old Obama's Simpson-Bowles commission that he neglected. Now's not the time to raise taxes, but I think once we get back on our feet, we got to know that $30 trillion is not sustainable, and it requires zero interest. And that's not good either, permanently almost. And I think finally, he's got to have an initiative that deals with the university. That is, I'm speaking as a member of our community of Stanford, but for the life of me, I don't understand why multi-trillion-dollar endowments are tax exempt, the income from them, when the institution is not any longer apolitical, and that can be adjudicated by a variety of criteria. And then I don't understand why the university has no moral hazard in promiscuously issuing these student loans to the tune of $1.6 trillion and then throwing these branded graduates or semi-graduates out on the market without any responsibility to see if they're...
I want to promise to you that we'll get back to universities, and I want to encourage my fellow panelists my fellow GoodFellows to jump in. I'm not going to call on you guys. I'm going to count on you to be your usual assertive selves and jump in when you also want to get Victor going. Anyone in there?
Well, John, I agree with Victor that it's much too early to write Donald Trump off. I've been amazed at the number of professional commentators on American politics, including in reputable newspapers or formerly reputable newspapers, who seem intent on making exactly the same mistake that they made 4 years ago on the basis of exactly the same data. It's almost a perfect illustration of the definition of madness. I caught one Washington Post journalist insisting that on the basis of Trump's approval rating, he had absolutely no chance. I was able to show him that he'd made exactly the same argument and been completely wrong. 4 years ago. I think the polling is also liable to be a bit misleading. It's not been such a feature of American life, but it became a feature of British life in recent years, that people became a little reluctant to admit that they were going to vote Conservative to opinion pollsters. And I suspect that we might be seeing some of that now. I'm a big fan of revealed preference, and I'm sure as an economist, you know what I'm talking about, John. When I look at what people are actually doing this year, a couple of things leap out. And it seems to me that they tell us a different story from the polls. Number one, gun sales have soared. June set a new record for background checks, but it's been a pattern actually throughout the year. And one thing we know from 2016 is that when a household owns a firearm, it's quite likely to vote Republican. In fact, it's one of the best predictors of a Republican vote that we have for 2016. So that's interesting to me. And I think that the scenes that we witnessed on television as one city after another seemed to plunge into disorder in the wake of the tragic death of George Floyd may have had something to do with that. There was also a great econ paper that came out just the other day, you maybe saw it, John, which showed that social distancing had actually gone up in cities where there were large-scale protests, because the majority of people had in fact stayed at home and were more inclined to stay home when there were protesters in the street, hence no great spike in COVID-19 infections after the protests. I think it's worth remembering that the majority of people in those cities that saw protests were not protesting. So there's something in that old cliche about the silent majority that I noticed the president is beginning to refer to. I think we might just find that there is a significant proportion of people who've been genuinely shocked by events in American cities in the past weeks. And I think that could turn out to be a real source of salvation for President Trump when we get to
I would agree with you
3rd.
that also we have there's a lot that can happen in the next couple of months, and the Democrats can easily shoot themselves, or let me find a better metaphor. The Democrats can easily align themselves with views that are anathema to a large fraction of the electorate. And if the cities turn into post-1968 apocalypse, if we continue to see the immense numbers of homicides, shootings going on in the cities, the police not there, the businesses shut down, not due to COVID, but looted and gone, even in the next couple of months, that is certainly going to make a big difference in how things are going forward.
I would just quantify what Neil and both of you said. We had a special congressional district not too far from where I live, and it was lost in 2018, I think by 9 points. And Mike Garcia, a naval graduate from the, maybe HR knew him. He was a pilot in Iraq, pretty conservative Mexican-American guy in a plus Democratic district, was down in the last poll, he was down by 9. And he won by 8. That was a special election. There was one in Wisconsin. There was a couple in a state legislature seats in Virginia of the same nature. The polls are funny. The Democracy Institute is a partisan Republican conservative polling group, but they actually were one of the most accurate, and they're independent, more libertarian than conservative. They had Trump even in a national poll last week, and the Trafalgar Republican state polls were the most accurate, and they've got him equal in Arizona, down 6 in Florida, and about down 2 or 3 in the Midwest. So I think there's a lot of things that are in fluid, and if he frames the election not about Donald Trump's tweets or not about anything other than he's civilization and the alternative is anarchy, in a way that Nixon did in '72 with McGovern, and then he'll do pretty well. And I think a couple of other considerations about what's going on, and that is that we've got kind of a peak, I think, viral spike, and I think Scott Atlas has written pretty persuasively on elements of that. We've got kind of a peak, I think, economic problem. I think it'll get a little better. And I think we're into peak sympathy with Antifa and Black Lives Matter. A lot of these institutions like Hollywood, the NBA, the NFL, the retired generals, they've lost a lot of empathy and sympathy, and I don't see them coming back out and making persuasive arguments why you should enjoy them. So I think it's still Trump's election to lose, and I wouldn't argue. I remember in 1988, and I was from a strong Democratic family, and my parents were giddy because Mike Dukakis in August was 17 points ahead of George H.W. Bush, and they were running wimp. Newsweek said they wimp of Bush. And then this was 88, and then they unleashed this hellboy called Lee Atwater. And when he got done with Mike Dukakis, it was pretty scary. I mean, he did the tank commercial, he did the Boston Harbor commercial, he did the Willie Horton commercial, and that 17-point lead evaporated just like Jimmy Carter's 7-point lead did with Reagan. And that was up in May, I think Carter was ahead. And so it depends on how they characterize Joe Biden. If Joe Biden at some point can't run a virtual campaign, a virtual convention, a virtual debate, I mean, he'll try, but he seems non compos mentis to me, and I don't mean that in a gratuitously cruel fashion. And the more he gets out, and if they get a guy like Steve Bannon that is unprincipled and tough and mean, and they unleash him and say, go destroy him, then who knows what's going to happen. But
Well,
I have
as
a question,
in the
I have a
60s,
question for HR, actually, John, if I can
Please.
jump in.
We haven't heard
Because
from
one
HR.
issue that really Victor hasn't mentioned is China and foreign policy more broadly. And I do think that one of the key things that you achieved, HR, in the administration was to set a new course for US national security strategy, especially on the question of China. And that has proved to be the key feature, I think, of this administration. It's less and less plausible now that the old relationship with China could be resurrected because the Chinese are themselves so obviously committed to Cold War II. And I wonder how far that's going to be an issue. Certainly, I can't see how Biden can be credibly portrayed as tougher on China than Donald Trump. Biden was vice president during the Obama administration. So, HR, what are your thoughts on the foreign policy aspect of this election?
Well, I think just to go back to one of the points Victor made at the outset, I think what the vast majority of Americans want to hear are real proposals, are real solutions to the problems. And I think that is one of the accomplishments of the Trump administration has been to take a fundamentally different approach to China, rejecting the assumptions that were obvious by 2017 that were obviously false. And that was primarily among those assumptions was that China, having been welcomed into the international order, would prosper and liberalize its economy as a result, and then liberalize its form of governance. And of course, in the COVID crisis has in many ways catalyzed the Chinese Communist Party's most aggressive behavior, and I think in many ways convinced all but a very few Americans that adjustment to policy was correct. And I think even more than that, what you're seeing today is that more and more of our like-minded countries, allies in Europe and across the Indo-Pacific are joining us. You just saw in the last couple of days, the UK's now rejection of Huawei. You have the National Security Advisor and Deputy National Security Advisor meeting with European allies today in Paris to talk about really not just Huawei, but the overall aggression of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think this is an issue that is beneficial to the Trump administration, and others could be as well. I think if there's a follow-up on Victor's recommendation for real solutions, I think we can no longer afford to propose non-solutions to problems. And John Cochrane, you alluded to this already. We had Roland Fryer, Victor, on in an earlier episode of GoodFellows, and he pointed to his new research that whenever there is a police investigation that requires police to disengage for a period of time from a particular community, guess what? Crime and murders go up in that community. And we're seeing that bear out today. So, of course, defunding the police is not a solution to the problems set associated with police brutality and unfair treatment and the horrors of George Floyd's murder. So I think that the time is right for President Trump, for Vice President Biden, to come up with with real solutions, instead of catering, I think, to what maybe they might believe are the predilections of their bases. And so I just wonder what any of us think the prospects are of a reversal of this polarization.
Let me use this as the moment to pivot to our culture war. As you'll notice, HR is always the guy who wants us to get together and sing Kumbaya and get along, which a spirit which I really must say I admire in you. And so let's pivot to the big cultural event of the moment, what do you want to call it, the cancel culture, the great awakening, whatever. I want to offer a few thoughts to kind of spur the discussion and let you guys take which of these in the directions you think are useful. One, we got historians and classicists here, so I would like to know parallel episodes in history, what you guys to comment. Public confession of sins, the ever-changing lingo you're supposed to adopt, and the merciless bullying and exclusion of heretics. I want us to remember that race is on the agenda right now, but this was a climate inequality and gender war a few months ago, and all those issues are going to be back. So let's keep our discussion on the more general question, which includes all of those. I notice it's not just opinions. Simple facts may not be spoken of anymore, like murder rates or tons of carbon and degrees of heating get you canceled. We'll talk about universities. I keep promising we'll talk about universities. We'll get there, but I'm struck how this has gone through all of the institutions of civil society: schools, nonprofits, corporations, media, the tech companies that now control our public discourse, government, NGOs are all in the throes of this movement, whatever we want to call it. The left seems to be eating its own, as the Harper's letter episode, as the New York Times shows. So is this the old left versus the new left, as in the 1960s when the old left lost, that the old left is doomed to lose? This movement is clearly political. It is about grabbing, using, and keeping power. I don't think we should forget that. And you're welcome to comment on episodes. So I brought those up as kind of directions to go, because this is like throwing up a big let's talk about it. But so Victor, where do you want to go on this whole big issue? And then everybody else.
I think you're right. It is a cultural revolution, and the dangers of a cultural revolution for the revolutionaries is that they tend to be systematic, holistic, all-encompassing, 360. So they're not just like the American Revolution. This is more like the French Revolution. I mean, we're not yet to year zero or the calendar dates and all that stuff, or the cult of the supreme being, but
a small minority takes over.
It reminds me of the supreme being. But what I'm getting at is that as they expand, they also dilute and they offend another group of people. So if you're going to watch the NBA and you see the average salary is $7 million and a guy won't even get up for the national anthem, then that's going to offend somebody. If you call 9/11 and you get a busy signal, that's going to offend somebody. If somebody loves to go into the park and see Junipero Serra or likes the San Gabriel mission, that's going to offend someone. And that's what's happening as it dilutes. It's getting it's going to start to touch people, and that's why the Democratic Party is very scared about it. And that's what happens with cultural web. That being said, they either consume their own or they dilute and they get a backlash. But if people don't speak up against it, then they create or transmit a false impression that they're the majority, like in the sense of the Red Scarves during the Maoist Cultural Revolution, or the Committee for Public Safety in the French, or more importantly, maybe even the Bolsheviks. So it requires people of good faith to stand up and say, I'm not going to fire this person. I'm not going to censor this writer. I'm not going to tear down this statue without a democratic vote of the city council. And once that starts, it'll snowball and people will see this thing as a sham. But right now, we're right at the peak. And we're waiting for a Robert Welch to come out and say, I've had enough. Don't you have any decency? And when that happens, this thing will start to dissipate very quickly. Once the Me Too got close to Joe Biden, that thing was gone. There was suddenly statutes of limitations and the Bill of Rights and constitutional protections. And then we had the old boy, she's lying. She's a liar, because it started to and Garrison Keillor and And when you get into people in the liberal establishment, that it ended. So I hope that it can be pushed, the end can be pushed along by people speaking out against it. And that's why I think.
I'm not so optimistic as you are. I mean, look what's happened to climate. If you want a job at a university, you simply cannot publish papers that say facts contrary to, and not just the idea that carbon causes temperatures to rise, the idea that climate change is inextricably wound up with progress on social justice and climate justice and the entire rest of the Green New Deal agenda. There, and the institutions in which we live now force not just your silence, force your speech. Stanford is announcing the diversity and training that's coming our way. It'll be interesting to see. I get lots of, when I read about these things, lots of people write me and say, you know, I don't dare say a word about this because of my job. Once the institutions are taken over, I mean, you said that some nice cases where this thing ends up, but there are cases where, like the Bolsheviks, where a small minority is able to use this
thing
to take over.
We had our run-ins with the university. It's been lost for a long time. And I just during this period, without getting explicit, I've had some big run-ins with Stanford about trying to censor what I've said. And
we are the most immune to this sort of thing of anyone. You know, what matters the vast majority of people who don't have the freedom we have to do it.
Well, I think the key thing is for us to set the example. We should set the example by the kinds of conversations we have on this show and the kind of scholarship that Hoover does. I mean, I think Victor's been a strong voice. Neil, you've been a strong voice. Or what are the conditions that lead to populism, progressivism, the interaction between those? I've heard both of you speak on this. I think, Victor, you gave a talk on this recently at the Reagan Foundation, and Neil, you gave a talk on this at the boot camp last year here, the policy boot camp, about, you know, what are the conditions that lead to this kind of populism and that interacts, I think, in many ways with progressivism and is pulling us apart, at least in the popular media and the popular perception. But I do think, and John, you give me a hard time about this, but I think I'm just predisposed in this direction because of my experience overseas, like seeing societies that are really divided and pitted against each other, and how destructive that is. And then also being part of an institution in our army in which people come with all kinds of backgrounds, and guess what? They come with all kinds of prejudices, and predispositions toward one another, and you see that melt away as they become parts of teams. They rely on each other. They're part of an organization where the man or woman next to them is willing to give everything, including their own lives, for each other. And guess what? They're not checking skin color, or anything else when you're in a fight. And so I just think, I hope that this crucible we're going through, and Neil, I think in your talk, you said, okay, here's some really bad things that could, that could lead to this kind of polarization. I think you mentioned pandemic. This is last year. And so I do think there's a prospect for bringing us back together. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What can we do? And what can we do in the area of reform, specific recommendations, what we do in academia? Speaking out, I agree with Victor, is the number one thing. I mean, people are afraid to even empathize with each other. You're not even allowed to do that anymore. You're not even allowed to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And so I think that this is very dangerous.
The Harper's letter was amazing because it wasn't the content of the letter. It's that you may have signed a letter that somebody else who's on the Twitter list signed, and that causes you to be harassed out of existence.
But John, you made it sound as if we were going to talk separately about universities, whereas of course universities are precisely where all these problems arose. We all live on campus now. I think that was an Andrew Sullivan piece a few years back, and on the day when he joins Bari Weiss in walking out of a liberal publication that can no longer cope with the strength and range of his views, it's maybe not inappropriate to quote him. I do think we have to ask ourselves why it was that the universities, which were of course liberal leaning back, if you want to go all the way back to the 1950s, then became progressively inclined. The number of conservatives dwindled and the progressives then hired the Marxists and cultural Marxists. It's been a trend across the country, and indeed in the English-speaking world more generally, that universities have become entirely unrepresentative of the ideological spectrum of the populations where they're located. And it's not surprising that the media and the tech world and the corporate world have shifted in the direction of an increasingly intolerant, illiberal ideology of wokeness. It came from the universities, and it simply spread out from those institutions. So we can't really talk about these things separately. I think what we're seeing is a kind of transformation of public life that originated in universities.
But I don't want to, let's move on to universities, but I don't want to underemphasize what I see as why it's so important right now is that it has spread to all the other institutions of civil society, starting with the schools. Your children cannot get through high school. They don't learn any Western civilization. They learn, that they don't learn all sorts of things that normally people learned in schools. So the schools have turned into indoctrination in a way. And the tech companies, yes, the young people in the tech companies and the media have come out of universities. And universities were always hotbeds of sort of whatever you want to call it, ideas, but it did not, in the 1960s, it didn't so permeate all the other institutions of civil society, which is really where in a democratic society, political control comes from. You can afford to have universities saying crazy things, as we did for 40 and 50 years, but it didn't turn quite into the ideology of a partisan politics until it takes over everything else. I mean, I see central bankers are now hot in for inequality and climate change. Goodness gracious, what are you guys doing? As just one small example. But yeah, let's turn to universities, because that's I'm reluctant, because we live in universities, so there's a tendency to navel gaze about our own lives, but that certainly is the place. Not just on the cultural thing. Victor's written quite about it, so he's our special guest, and I'll invite Victor to think about where things are going. One recent column to get you going is you've written about the coming obsolescence of universities. If classes can be delivered at a distance, why pay so much to go to campus? But on the other hand, if you're not learning anything worthwhile, why do anything? Maybe students outside science and engineering aren't learning any much at all. Isn't the university also a sort of a durable institution for forming the elite of a country, and in a way that you can't replicate on Zoom?
Yeah, it was. And I think we've got about 20 universities that their attraction is a brand, like a cattle brand. Come to Stanford, Harvard, Duke, Princeton, and then have the experience, and that's a synonym or a euphemism. You'll meet somebody from Goldman Sachs's kid, or you'll connect, you'll marry, and you'll be entrenched and embedded within the elite. You take that away with distance learning, and then you have to ask yourself, why do I pay $70,000 to stay in my basement to take teleclasses when I can download a Nobel Prize guy from Europe for $1? And so that's something we got to remember how we got here. The university did not used to educate half of American youth. It was about a third to a quarter. Once we sold everybody on getting this brand, it's about half now. And a lot of people in the university are not qualified. They're political hacks. And a lot of students would be much better off being autodidactic and getting a vocational skill, because Neil's right. The fuel that's driving this cultural evolution is a profile of a pajama boy, life of Julia, unhappy person who was from the middle class. They went and got their dash studies degree, 7 years. They worked on and off, and they got $70,000 or $80,000 in student debt, and they're part of the $1.6 trillion in student debt. And guess what? They look at themselves and they say, I'm 24. My grandparents came out of World War II. They bought a home. They got married. They had kids. They bought a car. They had a savings account. And I'm a barista in AOC somewhere, or I'm in Portland or Seattle, and this is supposed to be so cool, and I'm so articulate, but I know nothing. I have no real skills. I have no marketable skills. And they get frustrated and angry. And they are useful idiots for people a little bit more woke about how they can be foot soldiers in the revolution. How do we stop all of that? I think one big difference, I mentioned a couple, but I really think it would be really important to give people who graduate a simple choice. If you want to go into K through 12, you don't have to go through that awful school of education indoctrination. And you can get an MA for 1 year, just like we do with parochial schools with BAs, and you can teach. I had the misfortune in the Cal State system of teaching my classes in Greek and Latin in the School of Education. So I would listen to them next door, and it was all indoctrination, race, class, gender, nonstop. If you gave a student and said, you got an English degree, you want to be a 6th grade English teacher, you can go over there and get your credential, or you can just spend a year and get an MA and read Shakespeare. Either way, we don't care. I don't think you'd have a school of education left. The same thing about tenure. We need to go back to 5-year contracts, spelled out, this is what it is, and then you go on. If you don't fulfill them, you don't get one.
There is something, I want to riff on this. There's something hopeful that I saw in the aftermath of the George Floyd tragedy. The left realized that police unions are a problem, that you can't fire bad cops, and that the police unions have pushed policing to ever expand. Sooner or later, they may discover that teachers' unions have robbed a generation of Black kids and poor white kids and many other people on the lower end of American society from any hope of escaping. Because what you mentioned is perfect common sense, and it is perfectly forbidden by teachers' unions.
And what else, John? We have this ritual that we have an entrance exam, ACT, SAT. I know they're trying to get rid of them, but the idea is that if you come from my high school where I graduated, that my A was not as competitive as a guy from Palo Alto's A. So we had the SAT, ACT. Okay, fine. They say standards matter. Why not have an exit test? Because I have a hunch that somebody from Hillsdale would score much higher than somebody from Stanford. My own, after teaching at both universities. So if we had a national exit exam to get your BA and credential your BA, I think that would be very valuable because it would make these curricula a little bit more sensible about what skills constitute education. And then we got to do something about this nexus of huge endowments, huge amounts of money, and this tax-free income that is really inordinately spent on therapeutic, social services, administrators, diversity, inclusion, all that stuff. Provost.
Well, let me just, I hate to out Victor, but universities are, as has been documented, extremely political. You look at party affiliations, and it's like in the 99%. Actually, being a Democrat is too right-wing in many parts of universities. And they are moving explicitly to activism. Universities are, as you said, getting rid of the SAT for entrance, even though the SAT was a great way for people a generation ago to overcome the racial and economic prejudices of university admissions committees. My dad got into Yale because he was able to take a test and prove that a kid from Berkeley High actually might know something in the 1950s, which was assumed that he wouldn't. But they are now, universities are asking for activists. An activist is someone who knows all the answers and needs only to go and act and put them into place. And the universities themselves are moving to activism. I just saw 2 examples. Columbia has now joined Stanford to start a school of climate with an explicit mission for activism. Now, what is a tax-deductible, tax-supported, they get lots of money from the federal government, set of institutions that are allowed to run essentially a huge hedge fund on the side and a football team, yet are devoted to political, entirely to political causes on entirely one side of the political spectrum. That seems like a undesirable outcome. And I've noticed the Trump administration is talking about it's going to put IRS tax deductible status in the crosshairs, which will be interesting to see how that one goes.
One question that we should think about is why there are no new universities, because one of the big differences between our time and past periods in American history is that in the past, when people were dissatisfied with the existing colleges, they created new ones. The billionaires of an earlier era of the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, early 20th century created some extraordinary institutions, whereas today's
Chicago.
to name just two, Stanford, Chicago, but today's wealthy seem content to continue giving money to already very wealthy institutions, and I think that is a kind of decadence. It seems to me that we're confronted with such a profound problem, particularly in the ideological skew of universities. The ratios of liberals to conservatives or Democrats to Republicans are just enormous now. That the only reasonable response, because I don't think you can capture institutions back once they've been completely taken over by one side, is to create new ones. And that would be a kind of lesson of American history. If you don't like these universities, well, create some better ones.
But that's where the larger issue, I think, comes up. If you want to social climb in the era of philanthropy, giving money to Hillsdale College or founding a university devoted to classical liberalism is not going to get you a lot of points in the nonprofit circles of San Francisco or the tech giants. If you want, and to do well, you have to sell that your university is going to get students into good jobs in the elite. Well, the New York Times isn't going to hire from these places. The people who run the HR departments at tech companies in our more and more oligopolistic industry are not going to hire from these places. So you have it's not just starting a university as was possible in the old days where it was just really, really good. And you could hire, University of Chicago got good by hiring Jews, which Harvard would not hire. It's not enough to just be really, really good. So it's harder to break in than you think.
I do think that these demonstrations and the activity of faculty and op-eds and a lot of the things that we have associated with the universities, especially this new genre of this pathetic re-education camp-like letter from administrators to the larger community where we apologize, we're so steeped in endemic and we're going to do the following. After telling everybody they're going to lay off this person and they're going to cancel this sports program and they're going to do this, then they just fall all over themselves to say that all of these new administrative bloat positions are going to appear to pacify the mob. Given all of that, I think there is a sense in America that these brands should be really questioned. They remind me of sort of Coke when Pepsi came out. They're old. They don't certify that the people who graduate can speak or write well or think logically. They don't have a historical spectrum of reference. They're not very educated in economics or science. They know nothing about military history. So they're studies people, studies, gender studies, environmental studies. And I think a lot of people in the public.
Well, I just would like to say, I know it's just maybe a self-selecting group of students who I work with, but I am super impressed with the students I work with and those who I've taught in courses at the GSB and at the Freeman Spogli Institute. And I think that maybe one of the greatest hopes maybe for reform might be what the students themselves demand. And I think what you'll tend to see are maybe the most vocal students on fringes of issues. But in my experience, I know that, obviously at Stanford, you have an immensely talented group of young people. And those with whom I've interacted are well motivated, they're intellectually curious, and they are reflexively opposed and resistant to being fed any orthodoxy. Now, I think that that's a positive. I believe that we may be at the apogee, of the rise of the new left and the foisting of this orthodoxy on students in certain universities. And it's been on the rise, I think, since the end of the Vietnam War. I mean, I've not studied this. I think this is worthy of more focused research. But it was the Vietnam War that encouraged, especially students in the humanities, to get student deferments, to stay out of the war by continuing to study English literature and history and social sciences and sociology. And then these departments, in the crucible of that opposition to the Vietnam War, began to just reinvent themselves over several generations until departments are dominated in some cases by those who adhere to the orthodoxy of the new left. And I'm going to be super simplistic in this, but that orthodoxy is essentially all of the ills of the world prior to 1945 were due to colonialism. all of the ills of the world after 1945 were due to capitalist imperialism. And, you know, I'll tell you, Orwell was right when he wrote into 1984, if you control the past, you control the present. And what happened is a lot of the interpretations, especially of American history in that period of time, have made it into secondary education. And in many ways, this is a curriculum of self-loathing. And America is seen not as a continuing experiment in self-improvement founded on principles of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the Bill of Rights, but instead it is founded on perpetuating slavery, perpetuating inequality. I think that what we have to do in many ways is administer a historical corrective to break the orthodoxy, to teach all of the flaws in our history, to teach, you know, the failure of Reconstruction, to teach Jim Crow and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, to teach separate but equal, but to teach it in the context of the vast improvements, what Thomas Sowell talks about in his interviews recently. So I would just welcome, really, maybe academia we're casting as part of the problem, which of course it may be, but can't academia be part of the solution as well?
When you say that you found this island of students, but I do think they're self-selecting. I think all of us talk to Stanford Review students, or I have a few classic students that wander in. I'll just give you one example. I was asked to teach a class on hydrology, water issues, and that was kind of controversial. Very nice kids, kind of people that you're referencing. So I walked in and I said, will somebody tell me what bowls are on a pump? Silence. Will somebody tell me the difference between a gravel pack and an open bottom well? Silence. Can somebody give me any ratio of depth of well to electrical horsepower to gallons per minute pumped? Zero. How about irrigation drip versus mini jet versus furrow versus sprinkler? Zilch. This is hydrology, Stanford. So what do they know? John, you could tell me right now what that class is about.
Well, they didn't know property rights to water either, and the ability to resell it to the highest bidder.
I asked about riparian water rights, and I asked about 19th, because I'm in an irrigation district that has a 19th century water right to the Kings River. But they all knew that water transfers are bad, that reservoirs are bad, that the Delta smelt is an iconic figure, and they didn't know anything. But they had this bad combination of being very confident and very ignorant about water. And I mean, it was a complete waste of time. And these people are going to be turned loose and get into the tech world and the government world and the regulatory world. And then they're going to come down here to Fresno County and they're going to tell some guy who's working all day long on a 1,000-acre farm, this is wrong and you can't do that. And oh, by the way, that pond is an inland waterway and we're going to come and sample all of its water. So I'm hoping that the things we've talked about can restructure. And there's some really, you're right, HR, there's some brilliant, wonderful kids at Stanford, but every time I find them, not that I'm saying that they gravitate to Hoover alone, but they seem to be, I don't know, they kind of beaten down or they're in little cells. They remind me of Maquis in the French Resistance.
The problem right now is you can't put Tom Sowell on a reading list, or there will be a protest outside in front of your or Charles Murray. I actually know that one for a fact. But I think what's happening, it's not quite so bad. What's happening is, so far at universities, it has been hire a whole bunch of administrators, send a bunch of letters out to pacify the mob. People have realized that these majors don't get you jobs. Certainly what Stanford is doing is focus on science and engineering, learn to program computers, learn some math, learn how to run some statistics and do big data. You'll get out competent, you'll know how to actually do something, and that's where the university has value added. The problem with that is there was some value to and the humanities are dying. There are no jobs in the humanities. People don't want to they only take the classes if they're forced to as a matter of requirements, or if they had some interest in it and had the false notion they were going to learn something about it in those classes. The sad thing is you get people who do know some math and some equations and how to actually program a computer, but they are uneducated as citizens, as thinkers. When that person who actually might have learned the Navier-Stokes equations in his physics class is then presented with a hydrology problem in the Central Valley, he doesn't know the difference between I can't get this right, a gravel bottom or a muddy bottom well. So you need educated citizens as well. I think the universities can survive by moving themselves to tech things. And as an economist, what happened was in the 80s, a huge salary gap emerged in the 80s and 90s. People who went to university were doing tremendously better than people who weren't because there was this demand for skills. Then we made the classic mistake of, oh, rich people drive Cadillacs, so give everyone a Cadillac and they'll get rich. And people went to universities on borrowed money and nobody noticed it mattered which major you took. And so we started producing this vast number of people who have lots of debt and really don't know much. Victor pointed out, I think, a danger of this. In many other parts of the world, Victor has a great column on how this leads to revolution. The 9/11 hijackers were all university graduates who had been given majors in things that there were no jobs in. That is, when you expand on that thing and give people aspirations and debt and useless degrees, you do create a group of people who know just enough to be dangerous. Sorry, go ahead, Neil.
I was going to make a similar point that one of the lessons of history is that if you have a big increase in the supply of graduates, but limited opportunities for them, that is your revolutionary intelligentsia. And one of the reasons that I take seriously what we're seeing in American cities this year is that we've seen very similar things in cities all around the world in the past 12 months. Remember last year, all the extraordinary scenes from Hong Kong to Santiago by way of Beirut, and a very clear pattern emerged when I delved into it. In all the countries where there were large-scale protests, there had been massive expansion of higher education in the recent decades. So I think one clear lesson of history is that the expansion of higher education as an end in itself is actually a distinctly hazardous enterprise. But the other more cheerful lesson that I want to offer is an 18th century lesson. In the 18th century, the universities of Europe were not particularly dynamic places. My alma mater, Oxford, was particularly stuck in the doldrums of a previous intellectual era. And most of the intellectual excitement of that period that we call the Enlightenment didn't happen on campus at all, but happened in networks of intellectuals corresponding and communicating with one another, not necessarily reliant on a tenured chair. So I'm hopeful that one of the developments of our time, the emergence of an intellectual dark web, a network of disaffected intellectuals who've quarreled in various ways with their institutions, whether universities or magazines, this is actually one of the healthier developments. And I sense that there is a tremendous appetite amongst intellectuals for real freedom. And they see that appetite being checked by the institutions where they're based. Well, thanks to the internet, it isn't quite so difficult as it used to be to strike out independently. So I'm going to try and end this conversation on an optimistic note. I agree that actually there are many students, I don't think it's just a minority, who are deeply frustrated by the Great Awakening and really dislike the atmosphere of intimidation that exists on campuses today, in such a stark contrast to the campuses that I remember when I was a student. They're definitely fed up with this. And I think a great many professors and writers are fed up with it too. And the liberals are coming to realize that in fact the real threat to liberty doesn't come from Donald Trump, the supposed tyrant that they were so terrified of 4 years ago. That the real threat to their liberties as intellectuals actually comes from the left. That is sinking in. That's part of the significance of the Harper's letter. It's part of the significance of Bari Weiss leaving the New York Times. And it's part of the reason that we're having this conversation on GoodFellows, because Hoover is one of the few institutions, one of the very few left, where it's still possible to express conservative sentiments, as we've done on this show, and not tremble in fear of your future employment.
Let me just riff on that because I think it's an incredibly important point. I started with pushing the idea that the institutions of civil society had been taken over by the far left and enforcing conformity. Well, the answer is create your own institutions. You know, we've seen in the legal camp how important the Federalist Society was to give home to conservative thinkers. You may agree with them or not, but it is the home for conservative legal thought that otherwise is stamped out by the academia, by the bar associations, and so forth. Well, similarly, we need not just individuals who can speak out, but institutions that can help those individuals. When you're being Twitter mobbed, we'll help you. When you're being fired, we'll give you legal help. We'll give you the support that you need in order just to express the basic fact of, I may not agree with what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it, which is that's what's in danger right now. So it's not just individuals, it is institutions. And as long as the internet isn't censored, it will be useful, a very useful way for us to be able to create such institutions, which the left now wants to, the sensible left wants to be able to talk as well as we do. They're just as worried. My worry is that internet self-censorship, censorship by the woke staff is already pretty darn strong, and the move to censor it by government is stronger still. So I hope we have the opportunity to create contrary institutions in support of people's freedom to talk.
Victor, what would Socrates say? Can we end with that?
Well, Socrates never said it, but Plutarch said he said it. He said he was a citizen of the world. He was a first globalist. So he was, but I mean, he was a victim of the mob. And he was sort of remember the army lawyer, Robert Welch, you have no decency, to McCarthy. When he was convicted, according to Plato's tetralogy of dialogues, and in ancient Athens, when you were convicted of something, you proposed the punishment to the mob, the jury mob. And it was kind of a psychological tension, because if you asked for too little, they got angry and did too much. If you asked for too much, they showed sympathy and gave you little. So he said that after being found guilty of introducing new gods and corrupting the youth, he wanted a free meal every day on the expense account of the democracy. And that ended up with drinking the hemlock. So he had contempt. And he could have broken out, according to the Euthyphro, many times, and he chose not to. But I do think we need some people. This CEO of Goya Foods is a good moral example. When they were trying to cancel him out the other day, he said, you know what? Do your best. You do your worst, I'll do my best, basically is what he said. And we need more people to stand up like Socrates did and say, it's not going to happen anymore as far as I'm concerned. I wish we had one editor of a major newspaper, one university president, just one guy at Harvard or Princeton or Stanford, one person in the New York Times, Washington Post, that said, I don't know what's going on in the country, but I am not firing anybody in this editorial room, and I'm not giving in to any demand right now until I study it and we have a consensus. I'm just not going to do it. And I think it would, I mean, it's an improper metaphor, but it would be a Napoleonic whiff of grape shot. It really would. It would tell people we're not going to take it anymore. And I think it would start to dissipate, because forces are already dissipating, but we've got to push it along.
There are so many institutions where if you want to climb in your institution, you cannot possibly do that. The central banks are that way right now. I brought those up before. Universities, media, everywhere. I guess if a couple of people at the top have the courage to speak out all on their own, that will help. But boy, is it deep ingrained in.
Not do it if you're young. Neil and I have here at Hoover, but I have a lot of people that I correspond with them on a lot of PhD exams, and they literally cannot get people to serve on their PhD exams. They can't get jobs. They're ostracized, blacklisted because they're conservative or even moderate. As you said, conservative can mean you're a liberal Democrat in the university. So I think we all need to help those people in any way according to our station, and tell them they can be confident that they won't be punished, and we're going to try to help them get a job or get some type of employment. There has to be an underground railroad, so to speak, to help.
Okay, that's it, everybody, for this episode of the GoodFellows. We'll be back next week with a new conversation. On behalf of the GoodFellows, myself, H.R. McMaster, Niall Ferguson, and our special GoodFellow guest, Victor Davis Hanson, as well as everyone here at Hoover, stay safe, stay healthy, And we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. Thank you very much. See you next week.